we've seen no basis whatsoever that this is anywhere near around the corner. We've seen no basis whatsoever in my thinking that this is a decade away, 2 decades away.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stephan Livera podcast. Today we're going to be discussing whether quantum is BS. And rejoining me on the show is James O'B, or James O'Byrne. He is a longtime Bitcoin developer, has been focused on the custody side of things also, and was the creator of the Op Vault proposal, has lots of different views. Today we'll mainly chat on the quantum stuff, but maybe we'll get into some of the other covenants and general kind of core and protocol discussion. But first of all, welcome back to the show, and give us your overview on quantum stuff. What is the deal with this quantum computing and Bitcoin?
Hey, thanks, Stephan. It's good to be back. It's been a little while since I've been on the show, but I always love coming on. It's funny, quantum, while it's been sort of a recent highlight for a lot of people, I was kind of reminiscing the other day about when I first heard about it. And I was in an undergraduate computer science program, freshman year, and they had us go to a seminar about this thing called quantum computing. And the year would have been 2007. So it's been almost 19 years that I've been thinking about this stuff, albeit very passively. For the first maybe 10 years I had heard about quantum computing, I was very agnostic about it. And, people who you would talk to who were sort of close to quantum computing were anywhere from alarmist to kind of ambivalent to agnostic about it. And so I never really knew what to make of it for at least like the first 10 years of knowing about it. I always assumed it was something that was practical, maybe on the horizon, but still quite far off, or, maybe was incrementally making progress in the same way that AI sort of incrementally made progress for decades. But I would say maybe 6 or 7 years ago, through an accumulation of reading as well as talking to people, anybody, with a physics background or with a heavy duty cryptography background, I would kind of pull on quantum computing to see where it was at. And kind of the response that I would get, roughly directly correlated with, how smart I thought the person was, in their given field, was basically that, we haven't seen any kind of appreciable progress. It's really far off. Maybe it's theoretically possible, maybe not. And in fact, the people who I polled, who were closer and closer to having a rigorous physics background, were increasingly skeptical that it was even a thing at all. And so, in the last 2 years of quantum kind of coming to the fore, in terms of a quantum, a cryptographically relevant quantum computer posing some kind of a challenge to Bitcoin, that kind of ramped up both my interest and consequent skepticism, because quantum is being used as a sort of wedge, I think, to potentially drive the adoption of a bunch of new cryptography. So anyway, I'll pause there in case you have any interjections.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, obviously, the threat that most people are concerned with is this idea that if there's new advances very quickly in quantum computing, that and that combined with Shor's algorithm, which may allow people to sort of back out the private key for our Bitcoins and then steal the coins, etc., especially if you have an exposed public key for that, for those coins, or your XPub was exposed at some point. That seems to be the main threat. And then, of course, that has spurred a lot of research and discussion. The Hunter Beast pay to Merkle root proposal, BIP, has now been merged just as a BIP. So there has been some progress on that. But on the other hand, there are, let's say, detractors of Bitcoin who are saying, Bitcoin developers are not doing anything. But at the same time, there are real trade-offs to this as well. It's not just free. It's not just, you can't just snap your fingers and, now we're quantum secure. Like there's real work to be done. But let's just dig into the possibility aspect of it, right? Because it seems to be that there's been some recent announcements, from, Google and some other big quantum labs, and they're saying things like, oh, well, we've got this Willow chip, or oh, now it's not a matter of it's a matter of engineering capability. Where are you on that?
Yeah, so if you look at the timeline, debatably the largest number ever factored by a quantum computer is 15, and that was done back in 2001 by IBM. And 15, I guess, has some special structure that was particularly amenable to quantum computers. And so um, when the next attempt was made at factoring, which was 21 in 2012, that was a 10x effort over 15. And there's even some debate about the structure of that as to whether or not it was a legitimate use of Shor's algorithm. Um, so we really haven't seen, any demonstrable progress past that. There have been these kind of sleight of hand type experiments using quantum computing or some physical apparatus, but those are typically handicapped by classical pre or post processing. So it's not a purely quantum thing. Oftentimes, the way the quantum circuit is set up is with some knowledge of the solution. So really, these are toy sort of meaningless examples. While I think I'm not an expert on the experimental state of things like error correction or increases in coherence time and so forth, I think, to my knowledge, there remains this truly fundamental gap in terms of the idea of uh, one of the big fundamental questions is, can these qubits, which are basically probabilistic bits, so in a computer all computations happen on these deterministic bits in our classical computers where there's either a 0 or 1 state. In quantum computers, those computers work on qubits, which have a sort of probabilistic state, and there's an entanglement between all of the qubits in a computer, which creates all kinds of problems because maintaining a coherent quantum state is this very finicky physical process that we really, don't have great methods for in terms of scaling everything up. And so there's this philosophical or kind of theoretical question that's basically like, for a quantum circuit of sufficient depth, say something like running Shor's on even 128-bit ECDSA. Uh, does the depth of that gate, does the time spent in the computation kind of outstrip the physical limits of how long these qubits can maintain coherence? And so that's like an open fundamental question that even prompts people to wonder if quantum computing is like a feasible thing in the first place. That's setting aside all of the physical challenges that would accompany a quantum computer with a sufficient number of qubits to actually make something cryptographically relevant, applicable. You're talking about the need for thousands of logical qubits, which translates into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of physical qubits. You need multiple physical qubits basically to construct a logical qubit, and a logical qubit is kind of the equivalent of a single bit, in a classical computer. So there are varying reports on all the different physical problems associated with this. There are different methods of constructing qubits, and I couldn't tell you what sort of the largest physical qubit arrangement that's been come up with is, because again, there are these different techniques, all of which are kind of fraught in their own various ways. Some things require keeping these highly tuned machines at like totally frigid temperatures, and so there's different physical means of achieving these qubits, and they're all kind of fraught, and there's no indication that we even have the physical means of scaling these things up.
Yeah, so you're definitely more on the skeptic side. So do you see it as like it might never be a thing, or do you see it more like, no, it's like decades out? Like, where are you at there?
I think we don't know if it'll ever be a thing. And if it is a thing, yeah, my belief is it's many, many, many decades out. The the point of comparison that's often drawn with quantum is one that stems from AI, and that's this idea that, well, for decades, starting in the 60s, with the Lisp guys, and people had been talking about this notion of AI and general intelligence, and really we didn't have any kind of impressive result until a few years ago when we got these LLMs that, if not being a kind of generalized intelligence, at least sufficiently mimic that, to the point where they can sort of fool most people. Um, and so this, the argument goes, well, with AI, it kind of came out of nowhere, so we should kind of expect something similar with quantum. And well, I think that's kind of a nuanced discussion in itself. There was a ton of incremental progress with AI, and um, AI is this kind of purely virtual software problem. Quantum brings in this very thorny physical component, even if you set aside kind of the fundamental questions about whether it's feasible or not. And I think we've gotten really good as a civilization at dealing with these virtual software problems. It's a highly constrained environment. We haven't gotten so good, uh, in the last few decades at dealing with physical problems. I mean, for something as relatively simple as a, say, nuclear reactor, we can barely put those together anymore, let alone the kind of, metallurgical and engineering advancements that we would need for something like cryptographically relevant quantum computer. So I think there are lots of avenues for profound skepticism when it comes to this stuff.
So when it comes to Bitcoin, then what do you think Bitcoin developers and people building in this ecosystem should do? Should they be working on quantum mitigation, these kinds of ideas, or not? Or where are you at on that?
Yeah, it's kind of a tough question because it depends on what level you want to answer it at. From a fundamental basis, setting aside market expectations or worries on the part of non-technical people, I would say there are way better uses of our time as developers. There's kind of an infinite list of things that we could be working on. Um, and for me, quantum doesn't even breach the top 100 things when it comes to Bitcoin. Uh, but um, but we've created this situation where, um, because there is this kind of doomish hype around quantum and its possibility, um, it's now created, potentially significant price implications for Bitcoin. And obviously, to some extent, Bitcoin is this, you know, iterative self-fulfilling prophecy. And if we get to this point where, institutions and other sort of large entities are convinced that quantum's just 3 years around the corner and the Bitcoin guys aren't doing anything about it, that creates a massive headwind for Bitcoin adoption. And I've been really interested and kind of morbidly curious about the interaction between, say, a delay in Bitcoin's timeline. If sort of the Lindy meter on Bitcoin gets pushed back, whatever, 8 years because people are worried about quantum, how does that interface with, the security budget and the supply schedule? Because that's a very complex dynamic in itself.
Yeah,
So
I see. Yeah.
anyway, I'm sorry to get back to what you were asking. Um, uh, Ironically, I think there are some really good dimensions to some of the proposed solutions for these quantum um, mitigations. For example, like in the abstract, I'm very favorable to the content of BIP 360 as it's written, if not only because from the beginning in Taproot, it would have made a lot of sense to just have a spend to Merkle tree type without, having that
Yeah. So I
pub
guess
key
in a
on
way
top.
you're sort of saying some of these BIP 360 concepts might be useful anyway, regardless of whether quantum computing is a real
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was much more skeptical, hesitant when the proposal actually incorporated specific quantum resistant schemes. Um, because, when you start talking about putting new cryptography into Bitcoin, that's kind of a whole nother level of severity of change. If you're just talking about introducing a new taproot type that, in many ways just removes code from the existing taproot path, then that's a significantly less sensitive change to be making.
Interesting. Yeah, and I guess probably the other big one that people might want to ask you your view on is, look, James, what about NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology? They are saying, oh, look, they're running these competitions or these ways to have people work on post-quantum cryptography. They're recommending by a certain year that people should have post-quantum, and we're seeing some instances of the technology industry update to using these kinds of things, like VPNs and things like this. I think that might be because of the so-called store and decrypts later kind of concern. So I guess, what's your thought on that? Do you think that they are just overly panicked about something that's not going to be real anytime soon, or how are you thinking about this concept that NIST and others are already doing some form of post-quantum?
I think when you're dealing with a government agency, especially NIST, who has a history of trying to, in some cases, maybe they were led into it by other agencies, or maybe they themselves proposed knowingly some faulty constructions, like your deterministic random bit generator, or even just kind of looking back at other instances like the Clipper chip. I mean, really, if the government is strongly pushing cryptography your way, you should be very, very wary. Um, and there's a part of me, I don't really have substantial evidence for this, obviously, but there's a part of me that doesn't wonder if, well, ECDSA is working just fine. It's a good algorithm in the classical world. Um, if I were an organization like NIST or the NSA, and I wanted to come up with a scheme that was thought to be very strong when it concerned most actors, but maybe I knew about the way that a certain parameter was specified, or I was aware of some kind of structure that would allow me to, given whatever information they have, safely unlock this scheme if there was a national security risk, or a warrant or something. I would be really concerned about that, and I am really concerned about that, especially when you kind of pick up on the hysterics coming out of that community on this topic. But even setting aside the tinfoil stuff, I think there's just kind of a weird nexus going on between academia and business when it comes to quantum, because there are a lot of people who have kind of based their academic careers studying quantum computing. There's a whole sort of credentialing infrastructure there, um, and from my time in academia, I think there are a lot of really smart people and a lot of good work going on, but you can also get into these situations where you haven't really thought hard about the fundamentals of what you're doing, and you're just kind of proceeding on something because your advisor is there and is a subject matter expert. And so I could see there being this kind of emergent phenomenon around there being a big scene in academia for quantum computing. There obviously being business interests around these companies, um, and the two kind of fusing together and creating a situation where you know those three entities, government, business, and academia, are sort of unintentionally hyping this thing up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. And so it seems like, from what we're seeing and hearing, it's Google, it's IBM, it's Quantinuum, and a few other labs and things like this. And of course, known in the Bitcoin space is Stepan Snigirev. And so he is actually working on a quantum computer at, I believe it's called Plan QC. So he's like a cited researcher in the field, like postdoc, working at Max Planck and things like this. But he also worked on Spectre Wallet, as many of us know, and he worked on, I believe, the underlying library. I think it's called mbit, which is underlying like Spectre DIY. So he's probably one of the unique people who's actually like like a genuine expert in both sides of this. And I recall seeing him speak at a panel, and this is in November just of last year, so like 2 or 3 months ago. He was saying like only start worrying about this in like 20 years from now, you know? So you have like this whole range of different views, right? When a genuine like expert in the field cited working on this, he's saying, no, it's like 20 years out before you even really worry about this. And there'll be like weaker or other systems and cryptography that breaks down before, they get to Bitcoin. To me, it sounds like, well, that's pretty reasonable. And then there are other people like, there are some other talks and things where people are sort of saying it's like, 20 years out before Bitcoin is, at risk sort of thing. But then you have other people who are saying, no, look at their timeline. It's coming in 2 to 5 years. We need to like coordinate a big soft fork now. Yeah, it just kind of, I guess to me, the way I'm seeing it is like, again, I'm not an expert. I'm an 80 IQ podcaster. It seems to me like if it's a real thing, it's more like 15 or 20 years out.
Absolutely. That's my understanding as well. And even I remember Hunter Beast, who's proposed BIP360, very nice guy. But I remember him, kind of making a lot of noise on Twitter about this experiment some other guy on Twitter had done where he allegedly broke 5-bit ECDSA. But it wound up that, that wasn't at all true in a quantum sense. And there was a lot of classical processing done to kind of arrive at that result. And a lot of guessing, that doesn't scale well with the number of bits. So I just think we've, at a fundamental level, we've seen no basis whatsoever that this is anywhere near around the corner. We've seen no basis whatsoever in my thinking that this is a decade away, 2 decades away. So I think it all does come back to that in a sense. But yeah, again, I am all for BIP360 as written, but it's really nothing to do with quantum.
And so then I guess ask it in a more pointed way then. Let's say, hypothetically, it advanced like, okay, let's wave our magic wand. Let's say BIP360, the community rallied around that and said, yeah, let's do this soft fork. But then maybe in the future, it's actually, no, now let's do a soft fork to actually bring in, Shrinks or Sphinx Plus or, an actual, and then at that time, there might be a conversation around, well, are we going to raise the block size or have some kind of quantum witness discount to compensate for the fact that these quantum signatures are bigger? And then also, it's also a more real thing. There are real costs that we will have to pay. So, for example, we will no longer have HD hierarchical deterministic wallets. Things, we're going to lose Musig2 and Frost. We're going to have silent payments, theoretically, like some of these things would have to change. And even our hardware wallets might need to be updated and upgraded to deal with quantum signatures or post-quantum crypto. So let me ask you this way. Do you think, would you be for or against that, let's say that second step?
I think it's an absolute nightmare. If you just even look at how long it took to roll out SegWit, debatably Taproot hasn't even been fully rolled out in many ways. Most major custodians I've worked with don't support, spending Taproot outputs they can send to Taproot. But we all know that the deployment process for Bitcoin takes a very, very long time in a full ecosystem sense. And a proposed change like that for quantum would take a very long time and a lot of effort. But that's not even my fundamental objection. Okay. I look at cryptography the way that I look at, say, pharmaceuticals. It's allegedly old nurse's wisdom that you should not take a drug that hasn't been on the market for more than 8 years because these are very, very complicated things that we just don't fully understand. And really the only meaningful test harness is reality. Cryptography to me is the same way. You can do your reasoning on paper, but until you deploy a crypto system and put some actual risk behind it, you don't know what your unknown unknowns are. And I'm very concerned that the quantum froth is going to lead to a situation where we even consider committing new cryptography to Bitcoin that hasn't seen that kind of testing and battle proofing. I think that would be a horrible risk, even if it's just opt in, because if you can convince enough people that there's reason to add this cryptography to Bitcoin, it's a very short leap to convince a similar number of people that they should, encumber their coins using these schemes. And then what happens when, you know, uh, we find out that we didn't understand the scheme as well as we thought we did, even if in the case of like Sphinx, it's based on SHA-256, which makes it sound very safe. But, there's a big difference between being convinced of the efficacy of SHA-256 as a cryptographic hash algorithm versus SHA-256 composed, together to make a signing algorithm. There's kind of a big gap there. So I'm really, really averse to the idea of adding any new crypto to Bitcoin unless we really, really need to. And I don't think there's anything near a justification for that for quantum.
Yeah. Okay. And so we've spoken about the BIP360, Hunter Beast, and Ethan, and Isabel. I think the other author on that. So that's, I guess, one idea. There's also this Matt Corallo plan. So I don't know how much you know about that, or if you've kind of looked into that. But the gist of it, are you familiar with it or no?
I think maybe you or somebody mentioned it recently. It's the idea of cloning Taproot and creating a new witness version that's basically just Taproot, but when you spend to that witness version, you have sort of no expectation about being able to use the key spend. Is that right?
Yeah, oh, sort of. Yeah, yeah. So it would be, I think, so the way I understand it is like we would have existing wallets, include this kind of post-quantum tap leaf in the script path while people are still using the standard, Taproot stuff today. And then the idea is inside of that, people can do whatever they want, and it's not even revealed on chain today. So it wouldn't actually impact, but post, let's say, quote, hypothetically, Q day comes and the quantum computer is here and everyone agrees. And I guess then at that point, the idea would be to have a soft fork to disable the key path such that those users can now spend using their quantum, tap leaf fancy script path into whatever the new, quantum scheme would be. So at least in that way, it's not taking up massive signature space, at least today, and it would allow, but of course there's all these moving parts of like, is it a gradual break or is it a sudden break, and then can the community agree, yes, Q-Day has happened and it's time to now do something, but I guess as you understand that, let's say the Matt Corallo quantum tap leaf plan, are you like for it, against it, or do you have any thoughts?
It's inoffensive to me. I mean, it's not horrible. But I just think encouraging people to do things like that, with all the added complexity just really isn't merited based on what we know. It's certainly something that you could resort to. It's a plan to have. And maybe that's the way that Matt meant it, is kind of contingency if, whatever, 5 or 10 years from now, we have some new evidence that, oh no, this is actually getting closer. Maybe that's a fine halfway point, but I just think there's a real risk in getting people riled up about this stuff rather than saying something like, look, we're technical people. We have good understanding of cryptography. And we really just don't think this is a problem. Here's maybe our list of contingency plans if we are presented with evidence to the contrary. But, I think it's our job as engineers, to make those kinds of judgments and basically give people our best assessment of what the trade-offs are. And when one side of the trade-off comes with, tremendous complexity and, something like that, that really sounds simple, but for businesses and individuals and the wallet ecosystem is a pretty big lift. I just think we're better served by saying, okay, we could do that in theory, but let's wait.
Yeah, so wait and see. Yeah, yeah, let's see. It's an interesting point. I'm kind of inclined to agree there, but yeah, I just don't know what are people going to think. And then I guess the other point with that, the quote unquote Matt Corallo plan, let's say, I don't know if there's like a proper name for this. Like, I did an episode with him, I put it out recently, but I guess the other thing in his mind was, because people can use, like, because a lot of the coins are secured, like people have a BIP39 seed phrase, and there could be like some kind of ZK proof to prove that they still have the seed, the seed phrase for it, and then use a ZK thing to then allow them, like, hypothetically, if you had disabled, the key path spend, that those people could still recover their coins. So then in practice, it would just be like some of those early miners and maybe Bitcoin Core wallet users and maybe some of the big exchanges and custodians, and okay, they would do something fancy and do some other thing, like some kind of commitment thing, pre-commitment scheme. So I guess that's one thing. But at the same time, this would also be, I mean, assuming quantum is real, all this stuff, it would still be kind of chaotic, because then we would have to think about, well, how long is it going to take for people to transition over, right? And are we going to have like a bigger block size to allow that, to allow more people to actually transition out? And how big is the ZK proof, right? Like I think David Vexler, I believe, had an idea for it, but from what I read on a blog post, it looked like that ZK proof might be 500 kilobytes. So it's that might be a non-starter. Like, if every person has to put 500 kilobytes on chain, maybe there's some way to do like a proof, so it can be like a smaller amount that goes on chain and not the full 500 kilobytes. But yeah, it's just, there's a lot of complexity around that, isn't there?
Yeah, 100%. And, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with some of these like prophylactic schemes where you're hiding something in the tap tree for later reveal. I think the only qualifier there is that, ideally it shouldn't have spend power today, because what you don't want to do is turn your taproot metadata into this toxic waste where if anybody gets a hold of it and there's some kind of a fundamental issue, if it, say you're spending to, like an op success or something in anticipation of a new crypto scheme, if that gets loose, all of a sudden now, your coins are at risk of theft even before anything has happened. So if it's a scheme where it's like, okay, well, we're hiding this thing in the tap tree, and then at some point maybe we can make some consensus change that turns it on and, makes redemption given a ZKP or something possible. I mean, again, like, my position is go nuts, have fun. But I wouldn't, if I was working at a company, like in the capacity that I am now, I would not advise that, because it's a ton of work for something that's highly speculative. I mean, all of this stuff, the analogy that a friend of mine came up with is like, it's kind of like running around and being really fearful for the airline industry that like teleportation is 2 years away, because we have like the AIs thinking about, how to do teleportation. It's
T-Day is coming.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, for me, again, after years of kind of ruminating and reading about this stuff, albeit cursorily, but like it kind of strikes me as a similar thing. Now, granted, we don't have a teleportation industry, really, so maybe it's not totally analogous, but I think that's like the level of real threat that we're dealing with here, or approximate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll let listeners make up their own minds on that. Let's, if you've got nothing else to say on the quantum specific side of things, let's talk just kind of Bitcoin protocol. I know you maybe you have, let's say, your own views about how Bitcoin protocol development, let's say, should have gone, versus how it has gone. I know you were kind of flirting a bit with big blocker ideas, but also really interested in the governance side of things, obviously, as you were involved with the CTV and OpVault and some of these related discussions. So I guess let's hear from you, kind of Bitcoin protocol side of things. Where are you at there? Like, what's your overarching view?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Stefan, I am, as you know, a contrarian, and that's, I think, many of us are. Obviously, if you're in Bitcoin, you have maybe a disagreeable temperament that leads you to, constantly be prodding at things, and I'm certainly that way, as many of the listeners may know already. But I'm glad that you brought up the big block stuff because I do find that really interesting. And actually, you said something earlier about ZKP proof size that makes that somewhat of a relevant question. Hopefully, not too relevant anytime soon. But maybe the talk that I'm most proud of ever having given was at the last Op Next. I think that was 25. I gave a talk where basically I wanted to sort of reevaluate with fresh eyes um, a modest version of the big blocker view of the world, which is to say that, maybe instead of doing maybe second layer scaling isn't going quite as well as we all thought it would. And so what does the world look like where we kind of turn back to something like the block size as a method to scale? And the way I went about this is I basically modified Bitcoin Core to give me a bunch of timing information. I was sort of putting a clock around every major operation that happens between, receiving a block and storing the UTXO, all that stuff, because I wanted to get a sense of how my consumer hardware, on residential bandwidth, how much headroom I basically had to work with. And I was very, very surprised at the results, which I won't try and, go too much into. You can go watch the Op Next talk if you like. It's something called something like modeling block size constraints. But the long and the short of it is that I was very, very surprised with the amount of headroom that my, $1,000 computer connected to gigabit internet had. And it prompted me to kind of evaluate this larger question about like what's actually the trade that we made in terms of, being really principled about small blocks, and whether that was just kind of this exercise in, fetishizing like Raspberry Pi node runners and, these like hyper constrained situations where you have to beam, blocks on satellite. And, I was absolutely one of those guys in the block size wars. I was as small blocker as they come. But to be honest, the things that I measured really forced me to reevaluate and kind of, juxtaposing that on how things have gone with Lightning. I mean, people forget that in the original Lightning white paper, Drya and Poon basically say like, hey, the only way this stuff like works in the way that we want it to work is with a block size increase.
Right. And I think I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 120 megs or something like this.
Yeah.
Right? That was the number
Yeah.
they gave back in the, I think, 2015 or 16 Lightning white paper.
Yeah. That's right. Exactly. And so, I think it's an idea that's really gotten a bad rap. It's fallen out of favor. I mean, obviously, like there are laughable, like parameters, like the BSV guys doing gigablocks,
right, gigamegs.
Like yeah. Like that's completely ridiculous and cartoonish. But I think like writing off the idea of ever touching the block size is not only like ill-advised, but maybe unrealistic, depending on what happens. So anyway, yeah. So that's something that I was kind of looking into, just as a fun contrarian exercise. But to your general question, like how do I feel about Bitcoin protocol development? Yeah, I'll be honest. When you asked me to come on, I was kind of surprised. I was like, I'm like washed up and semi-retired at this point. What does he want to talk to me for? Um, because of, I think I had this experience, navigating the process of proposing a consensus change. And, I wasn't really thrilled about, the way that Bitcoin development as a human system is set up to kind of process and evaluate that. And a lot of people think I would expect that, that really burned me out and jaded me. But the honest truth of it is that, from the very beginning of my development career in Core, which was like 2015, it's really just been an uphill battle to do anything useful. And that's for a variety of reasons, I think. One of the things that people forget is that in as much as Bitcoin is an experiment in crypto economics and distributed systems and cryptography, it's also an experiment in human organization in terms of how the development works. And, my belief is that for many years, maybe up until Taproot, Bitcoin operated under this sort of implicit hierarchy where there were a few guys who really, if they wanted to go a certain direction and it was like plausible and there weren't any obvious problems, like that's the direction that things went. And what happened was that those guys kind of abdicated in the sense that they stepped back and, in some cases explicitly said, hey, I'm not going to do this consensus stuff anymore. And that created this vacuum that I think everybody thought was going to be filled by some kind of a like leaderless, meritocratic, cypherpunky online human organization. And I think that was kind of naive in hindsight. And I think that vacuum hasn't been filled and the protocol hasn't meaningfully progressed since Taproot. And really there are no signs that it's going to, despite some very credible proposals, some serious work that's been put forth. Me and Jeremy spent a lot of time on CTV. I mean, Jeremy especially, for years and years and years. And I started out as a sort of CTV misunderstander critic. I didn't get it when I was first presented with it, maybe in 2019. And then, when I started working on custody and vaults and things like that, I finally got it and it clicked. That was in 21. And, there were a lot of smart, well-intended people, working on that proposal, and just, the way that it was received by many who are high status in Bitcoin, didn't strike me as productive. And really, I think it's an interesting time to kind of re-examine all this because, I ultimately wound up kind of organizing what some perceived as an ultimatum. It was really just meant as kind of an open letter, this, ctv-csfs.com, which is still up. You can go read it if you aren't familiar. But the idea was that, many of us who wanted to keep, pushing forward this idea of covenants in a concrete way, were taken aback by how little progress had been made. And so, a lot of very, very smart longtime contributors signed this letter basically saying, hey, we recognize that, Core, or at least theoretically, doesn't like totally run Bitcoin, but at the same time, as the most popular implementation, if a consensus change is going to be even evaluated, we need some engagement support from Core. So we'd really like you to, review these pull requests and merge the substance. Guys like Andrew Polstra signed that letter. A lot of hash rate signed that letter unintentionally, really. And that was back in June. And there was sort of a 6-month, hey, can we get this done by then? That would put us at, December 25. It's now February 26. So that effort sort of failed. And that was about as composed an effort as I could muster. What we got in response was sort of a counter proposal from Sanders and Poinceau that, in plain terms, nobody really paid much attention to and just kind of served to fracture
Right, this was
the
the
conversation.
template hash proposal. So, in your view, how does template hash compare with CTV and checksig from stack?
Template hash is basically just kind of a less featureful version of CTV in the sense that it's taproot only, which is a major constraint for custodians because it turns out that if you're a serious custodian, probably you've got an HSM deployed at the moment, and no HSM on the market has native Schnorr support. So I'm not aware of a single custodian at scale that's supporting Taproot. Maybe BitGo. I think actually I know somebody over there.
Right, because didn't Brandon Black work on their music too?
Yes. Yeah. I didn't want to say, not knowing if he was public about that, but yes. But even then, I'm not sure if that's, I'm not sure how mainline that is within BitGo. He'd be able to tell you. I can just say that, a lot of the custodians I've looked at, work with, don't really have plans to support Taproot because there isn't a compelling use case given how hard it is. And so, with template hash being Taproot only, you have certain uses that just kind of rules out, in terms of doing things like vaults and pre-signed transactions, or replacing the need for pre-signed transactions. The other thing is that, one of the appealing uses of CTV was kind of this off-label use that the BitVM guys had come up with, which was essentially committing to other inputs within the transaction, and template hash strips that out. The other thing the template hash does, and maybe the most fundamental objection that guys like me and Jeremy Rubin had, is that it commits to the annex, and we don't really know what the annex is for yet, and so I just kind of think it's premature to
Oh yeah.
lock ourselves into to that.
I mean, you correct me. You probably know better than me, but I thought there were some forms of LN symmetry that used the annex. I thought that was one thing that apparently might be used for. And I guess Greg Sanders is like had done some work on LN symmetry, so I don't know. Maybe it's that. I don't know. Do you know?
Yeah. I think that maybe was the motivator, was that he had applied it somehow. He wanted template hash to work with LN symmetry. My objection was, these are sort of orthogonal concerns. You could leave CTV as is and, simply introduce some opcode that's like, allowing you to commit to the annex if you want to. But I'm sure there may be cases where you don't want to. For example, one of the proposed uses of the annex may be, if you ever get to cross input script aggregation, there may be some metadata that you need to shove into the annex. And so I just think it's kind of an unnecessary design choice, to make that commitment if you don't need to, rather than decomposing it. So anyway, it's not really that important, because the upshot is that, the conversation kind of fell apart because you had all these people who were very enthusiastic about using CTV, and, the sort of core ivory tower guys came along and said, well, we don't like CTV, but we like this other thing that, we think does a better job. But unfortunately, people's bandwidth is limited, and I think there was it's very hard to reproduce the kind of Lindy accumulation of review and understanding that CTV had. And again, it kind of comes back to the fact that this consent manufacturing process that used to be very robust in Bitcoin, that was very robust during the SegWit Taproot days, for better and for worse, that just kind of no longer exists, because you don't have as strong a leadership hierarchy within the technical community.
I see. And I'm curious your view on, let's say, like, think about like an AJ Towns, where he's got this kind of slow and steady philosophy in terms of how, or he's written a bit about how he thinks, let's say, consensus changes should be pushed forward in Bitcoin. So as an example, there's this Inquisition, which, as you know, but for the listeners, it's a signet, which is sort of like a testing ground for various Bitcoin ideas. And I think even right now, actually, there is a Bit54 consensus cleanup, which is now just recently active in that Inquisition signet. And so I'm curious your thought on that. Like, is it just a matter of like slow and steady? Is it just a matter of like it just has to sort of take a longer time necessarily?
Well, I think nobody's saying fast and loose, obviously.
Of course.
But yeah, there are different gradations of slow and steady. AJ and I have worked together a bit. We didn't have a great working relationship for some reasons, but to my knowledge, right now he's primarily focused on like a Lisp dialect that he's working on as a kind of maybe alternative to simplicity. And I just look at those kind of changes as, and this might surprise people that I believe this, I look at those kind of changes as inappropriate for Bitcoin at this stage, because I think Bitcoin should be done with these engine lift style massive overhauls that just introduce reams and reams of new code and substantial updates to the scripting model. I think those days are over for Bitcoin. I think like we have and should ossify past those things, because those are truly existential changes to the scripting environment. Adding something like, say, CTV or check template verify, check contract verify, which is Salvatore's great proposal. Those are more akin to adding time locks rather than like something like SegWit or Taproot,
Right.
which were
You
really
see them
these
as like marginal improvements rather than wholesale, like take out the engine and plug in a new engine kind of changes.
Yeah, exactly. And Taproot was done in such a way that it's very, very upgradable. Taproot was, in many ways built as that framework, so that okay, we don't have to do this giant lift anymore to sort of change the world in terms of scripting. So I look at simplicity, I look at bullish, which is AJ's thing, and I'm just very skeptical, because if simplicity is supposed to be simple, but if you actually go and look at the code, number one, it's horrifying, and number two, you're shifting the question of what is consensus into what do the jets do and which jets are you offering, and to make certain operations efficient, like say SHA-256, you need this like jet for that, which is an escape hatch, because simplicity itself is this hyper simple, constrained language. So you're really just kind of like moving the goalposts into what gets a jet, what doesn't, how consensus compatible are the jets, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying there wouldn't be benefits to simplicity. I do think there may be, but that's not incorporating the price of the complexity of the changes, which I think are substantial. So anyway, in terms of AJ's slow and steady thing, I mean, I think that's easy rhetoric to give. But the reality is that Bitcoin does have this natural hardening process, which should exist. There should come a day where we're really not touching the scripting of Bitcoin. I think that day actually may already be here, just because of the organizational realities of how Bitcoin changes. And, you've got guys like Michael Saylor saying, no way, get the developers away from this thing. That used to really, really rankle me. And I think I've kind of hit a Zen moment with it, more or less. Because partially thanks to you and other people on, other friends of ours, I've kind of realized that the limitation isn't really like, yeah, Bitcoin itself is technologically limiting, but really the fundamental limiter is like people and the way that people want to use Bitcoin. And, the reality is like most people just don't want the responsibility of doing self-custody. And I thought for a long time, I still think that it's my job as an engineer to make that easier, to make it better, to introduce tools that, let people take possession of their coins without really, really worrying about it, or without it being a really, really hard process. It's my job to try and future-proof the protocol when it's like the monetary backbone of the world, and increasingly limited numbers of people can actually get access to holding UTXO themselves without a trusted intermediary. I look at that as my job, but I also understand that reality is what it is, and Bitcoin may just kind of have run its course in terms of these script level changes, and we've got what we've got, and we should make the best use of it.
Yeah, interesting. And so, obviously, setting aside things like there's like this timestamp bug in like 80 years from now or whatever, like assuming everyone's going to be cool to do an upgrade for that, that's not a big deal. But certainly, because that'll be a hard fork. But from what I've heard, it's like the other side of that will actually not create a block, because like it'll run out. And anyway, that's kind of a small thing. If you like, because there is this question of, should Bitcoin protocol development really go hard down this pathway of like CTV or L-enhance or CCV and some of these ideas that enable things like, LN symmetry, or make it easier to do things like ARC and these various, forms of, L2s that then enable better self-custody. And, on one side of it, it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously you and I obviously would like more people to self-custody, but at the same time, I yeah, as I've mentioned before, it's like, where's the real bottleneck? Is it actually just like a social and economic thing that, you know, even now, like if we look on mempool.space right now, how costly is it to, to get next block? You can get 1 sat per vbyte. In fiat terms, it's 9 cents to get
Yeah.
next block confirmation.
Yeah.
So it's all like, we can talk about all these people doing self-custodial lightning and things like that, and then there's actually just like all these people just using either custodial things or L2 stuff like lightning and arc and spark and ecash and fedi and liquid and whatever. So I guess where do you sort of land on that? What's the next adoption pathway?
It's a great question. I had this experience recently where a few years ago I set up this home security system. These cameras that don't talk to the internet. They're cheap Chinese cameras that I've network isolated. It's totally self-hosted, all this stuff. And I love it. So I made a Twitter post a few weeks ago saying, "Hey, I did this thing. It's cool." And the response was overwhelming. People were like, "Oh man, this is so cool. I really want one." And I thought, okay, well, maybe I should productize this or something. But then it occurred to me that, I spent like a good 2 weeks of difficult, like running Cat5 through your house is not easy. And it dawned on me that a lot of people think that they want a self-hosted camera system, but probably what they really want in terms of a user experience is like throwing up 3 wireless cameras and then having their Samsung TV display a picture-in-picture when someone's at the front door, which I totally don't have. It's this crazy hackneyed, setup that works for me because I'm highly technical. And so it was just this experience of realizing, it's this classic issue that people say they want privacy, people say they want self-custody, they say they want to be resilient, but when it comes to actually kind of doing the work to make it happen, it's very difficult. So yeah, I really thought that things like OpVault and CTV could create this situation where you had you could just have a cell phone and maybe an exchange account, and you would have near cold storage level security just receiving through your phone. That was kind of my big golden dream. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe then people will actually take possession of their coins in larger number. But, I think the reality is that even then, people want to be handheld. They want a great user experience. They want to be able to call somebody and say, "Hey, what's going on? This isn't working," or they don't even want to get to that situation. And so the exchanges definitely offer that. In terms of future tech, I've tuned out a little bit in the past few months. I mean, I know some of the ARC stuff was very exciting. I mean, in fact, is the company called Second? Stephen Roos
Yes,
and Eric.
Stephen Roos and Neil Woodfine and the guys. Eric,
Lovely guys. You just couldn't be nicer, smarter guys working on this stuff. And so I'm really happy that they are. But Stephen was one of the big guys pushing for CTV CSFS because he said, man, it reduces the interactivity requirements. It allows us to do things in ARC that are really, create this better user experience that people are actually going to want to use. I think to absent some kind of tail risk, black swan event that really puts us in a bad situation, legally or geopolitically, in order to get people using Bitcoin natively for things like payments, or even storing their own wealth, you need to create a user experience that's like on par with credit cards. And that's very difficult, super difficult. And so I'm glad those things are being worked on as a sort of, prophylactic for if that day ever comes. And, we've got this backup system that's like works well enough. I think that's great work to be doing, but I just think we're going to probably continue to be disappointed by systems that roll out, and it turns out that they're either more proprietary than we thought, or they don't work as well in practice as we thought, which I think is my assessment of how Lightning has gone. I think hype for Lightning in like 2020 was so strong, so big. And I think almost everybody in varying degrees feels a little bit of a hangover from that because it didn't quite materialize maybe in the way that we thought. Now, other people say it works great, and they're probably right. But I think expectations were high, and so we should rein that in for any subsequent layer twos.
Yeah, I think it didn't happen the way we all thought it would. And, I put my hand up as well. Like, I was obviously a promoter of Lightning. I still am, to be fair. But, that vision of like everyone having a node in their own home and like connecting to it over Tor and like paying. Now I did that, but it's just most people were not. And, it just kind of, it's sort of becoming more like a professionals game. It's more like a professionals game of running Lightning and being an LSP, and it's sort of it's not really seen as like a quote unquote everyday pleb thing nowadays. And now maybe we're just kind of in a local bottom. Like maybe there is an element of growth. Like maybe we're going to see a lot of FEDI instances come up, and that's going to be like one way that like Lightning gateways are around there, and and maybe we're seeing improvements in the self-custodial, like at least the mobile UX, right? Phoenix is amazing. I use Phoenix, like it's my daily driver. Wallet of Satoshi have a Spark self-custodial version now, which works pretty well. The Arc guys are working, and they've got their own kind of version of it. The Bull wallet has kind of Liquid, but Francis is experimenting with Arc in the background there. So, it's almost like, in one way, maybe we scaled too well, loosely speaking, right? That like, because so many people are now using these different L2s or whatever you want to call it. If I know some people get stickler about like, is Liquid an L2 and so on, but whatever. Like if we just consider them broadly as L2s, they've brought the fees down a lot, and people are using them now. And Coinbase and Binance and OKX and Bitfinex and all these big exchanges, they have Lightning now.
Mm-hmm,
So in that sense, we won, but it's still it's not as, let's say, trust minimized as maybe the initial dream was.
Yeah, well, it's very much like the development of the internet, right? I think if you and I were hanging out in 93, we'd have these grand visions about everybody having a mail server in their house and, it being this great decentralization of data. And it's a bit of a sobering comparison because if you look at the way the internet functions now, I mean, obviously it's magical in many ways, but in other ways, everybody's either going to like TikTok, Facebook, X, Instagram, and that's, in some ways like the entirety of the internet for 99% of people. So yeah, I think it is that principle that running infrastructure is very hard, especially reliably. And so if you have, say, a Fediment installation, or an ARC, an ASP, you have to make sure that stuff stays up. And that's not an easy problem. I'm speaking as a former DevOps guy, still current DevOps guy for my household. And, even for someone like me, it's challenging. So yeah, maybe at some point we'll get some kind of a technological bailout and there will be some incredible way to do this stuff. But I do think that things are going to centralize just as a course of nature, and maybe that's okay. The AI stuff is very interesting because I do think it brings a lot of power to individuals to run these kinds of things. People who maybe otherwise like weren't programmers, don't really know how like Unix works, but they can get the AI to teach them essentially how to do this stuff. I think that's kind of cool, but that's probably a marginal phenomenon rather than some kind of a huge phase shift in the way that computing works.
Yeah, it's almost like the limiting factor is agency, right? Like as in personal agency, the kind of person who will go and like try and use this tool now to figure it out. Whereas maybe before it was like you had to be a real quote unquote hacker man to get in there and like figure out, oh, here's how you do your command line stuff and whatever. I guess another thing we should chat about is obviously you were the guy behind AssumeUTXO. And of course, maybe some of this ties into kind of the big blocker stuff as well. Because, these approaches like AssumeUTXO and Utreexo, some of these ideas, maybe they can be sort of combined in such a way that quote unquote grandma can have an easy validating node that spins up really quickly. So do you want to just comment a bit on that? Like in terms of like, obviously you were the guy behind AssumeUTXO. Do you want to give us any updated thoughts on that and what it means going forward with Bitcoin node syncing?
Yeah, I couldn't be more bullish on that arrangement. I actually am kind of maybe working on something in this department, but you're exactly right. The union of AssumeUTXO and Utreexo and pruning, as well as technologies we've had for a while, like compact filter block or um, compact block
Compact block
filters.
filters that
Yeah,
one bit 157, 158.
yeah,
Yeah.
good memory, good memory. Um, yeah, the union of that tech creates a really, really exciting node environment, I think. And um, I'm sort of almost amazed that nobody has gone at it. Uh, I might have to myself, because I think when
Yeah.
you combine those things, you
It is
create a
pretty
situation.
impressive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I'm curious, have you seen the Floresta project?
yeah, I have, and I think that's a really cool direction. I'm totally supportive of what those guys are doing, and I think there could be something very exciting there. I'm a little bit of a Rust bear. I was kind of poking through their cargo dependencies file, and there's just a lot of stuff in there. And when it comes to things like node software, I'm very, very conservative in terms of the dependencies that I take on. So, but in general, I'm highly supportive of stuff like that, and I think that's a very exciting project with some very exciting features behind it. But even if, what's funny is, like, even if core itself was packaged with slightly different defaults, like if it was set to, say, retrieve and assume UTXO snapshot, the latest one from whatever bitcoincore.org, which again isn't a security assumption, it's not a trust assumption, because the hash of whatever is being retrieved is hard coded in the source code. It's checked against whatever snapshot's being loaded in. And then you configured pruning. Utreexo is a little bit space age and a bit more of a kind of a scaling feature, but even just those things, you'd have a lightweight node up in operation for most people, I think, within like an hour. So I think that would be really, really exciting. And yeah, maybe you'll see some developments from me there. Maybe not. We'll see.
Yeah. And so I've got a few directions to go here, but as an example, I mean, last I checked, maybe 1 or 2 days ago, I looked up these numbers. So on the kind of global node stats, I think this is Luke Dasher's stats actually. Apparently, there's about 88,000 Bitcoin nodes around the world, and of that 88,000, it's about 24,000 that are reachable on, I think, BitNode's dashboard. So, isn't it kind of funny that we have, the estimates for Bitcoin adoption is something like 100 million, maybe 200, maybe 300 million, something in that range. And then out of all these people, it's only, call it 100,000 people who are running a Bitcoin node.
Mm-hmm.
On,
Mm-hmm.
why is that in your view? Is it just, again, the agency aspect of it? Like most people are happy to just trust Trezor, Ledger servers or, their exchange, this kind of thing.
It really is. It's like, well, what benefit am I getting out of this on a daily basis? You and I know there's an abstract benefit, but it's very abstract, and it's hard to quantify in your daily life. And again, I want to reiterate, keeping computers up and running reliably is difficult. Managing a network connection between, say, your home computer and your mobile phone, it's not hard, but for most people, it's just a domain they have no experience with, familiarity with. They don't really know what's possible, what isn't, how hard it is, how hard it isn't. And so yeah, I think it's kind of the same. It's the same problem as, like, oh, why aren't more people running their own Lightning node or Fedi mints? It's that same sort of thing.
What about this concept of just mobile only? Because we are kind of moving into this world where there are people who don't have a laptop or a desktop, they just have a mobile. And maybe the Utreexo thing of like having a compact state node or a Floresta thing, which is like, the proverbial grandma can just have a phone that is a validating client, let's say, something like that. But where are you at on this concept of mobile nodes and just mobile nodes?
The hardware there is getting really impressive. I mean, it's been really impressive for a while, and bandwidth doesn't seem to be a limiter by any stretch of the imagination. So I think it's technically feasible, probably, today. Even if you're just saying, okay, we pick a sort of aggressive assume UTXO height that's relatively recent or whatever. In terms of just receiving the block and checking the SIGs, I haven't done any benchmarking. You would definitely need to do that. That doesn't strike me as an inconceivable thing. It's probably, very easy from a computational standpoint for these phones. What winds up being the kind of unexpected difficulty with something like that, which I found out a few years ago, is that mobile operating systems are very hostile to programs just running in the background.
Stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's like, it's funny because that's not like any kind of fundamental limitation. It's just sort of the way the platform operates. And so I think that's probably where most of your trouble would be, ironically, if you were willing to pick a kind of aggressive assume UTXO height.
Yeah, interesting. So it may just be, I mean, that's probably why most of the mobile wallets that I know are just kind of the Electrum server model. So they're just calling out and saying, feed me my balances. And, maybe there's a reason for that, right? Like it's kind of, in one sense, yes, we can say, there's not a lot of, let's say, we can go out and morally lecture people that you should be self-sovereign. Like the finger wagging is not really going to do it for most people, right? They're not going to care. They're just going to do whatever is practical and cheap,
Yeah.
Or another example would be like, people love to complain about economy class long haul flights, but guess what? People pay for it. People do it because they would rather not pay. And I don't blame them, but it's, people aren't necessarily going to admit these things. But that might be a big driver for them, like just the price. It's more expensive to fly business class or whatever. And can we blame them for that? Like, and so I guess my point is like with the phone thing, yeah, we can say, well, Apple and Android are really aggressive about battery saving, but could that be because the end users want full day battery life?
Yeah.
So is it
the
really,
average case for that is better. Yeah, it's like that's a rational decision for them to be making. It's a good feature probably. Most apps shouldn't be running in the background, unmitigated. So, no, I totally agree. I think the sad truth that I'm waking up to is that for that kind of fundamental shift in self-responsibility to happen in any appreciable amount, it's going to take something really catastrophic, man. Like, a major exchange is going to have to go under, or, people need to feel pain and that too is a rational adaptation, right? Like, I mean, if like, not everybody can be like you and me, in that, we're like thinking about these eventualities and like kind of preparing and like, spending a bunch of time, worrying about our, say, privacy footprint or whatever. Like, most people don't have time for that. They just like, they have to take out the trash and go to their job and make money and, feed their kids and whatever else. And so for people to actually rationally reallocate attention to something like Bitcoin custody or even paying attention to Bitcoin, I mean, people are incentivized to pay attention to Bitcoin because their money is obviously evaporating in front of their eyes. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, this is, this might bail me out of that very thorny problem. But in terms of actually taking self-custody, it's like there's no hair on fire thing in recent memory for most people. Now, you and I, remember when Mt. Gox went under, we, watched BlockFi go under. Events like that, should make an impression on people. But I think it's going to really have to be something big and scary and probably painful to kind of like shake people to their core.
Nowadays it would have to be something went wrong with Coinbase custody, right? I mean, or like a BitGo or one of these like massive custodians.
Yeah. And what would that do, man? What do you think would happen? Like, if Coinbase custody goes under, do you think that the economic world is just going to kind of let that fly? Like,
well, I mean,
DAO
Bitcoin
style?
would survive, but yeah, it would be a pretty disruption.
I think there would be some very uncomfortable proposals put forth if something like that happened.
You reckon they would try to roll back or try to,
I could believe that. I mean, I wouldn't even know who would propose it necessarily, but I could absolutely see people saying, well, we can't let this, like, and maybe, I don't know, maybe,
but remember, there was CZ or someone floated the idea to for Binance, right? When Binance had something and someone
Didn't
I can't
I
remember
thought
who.
Jeremy proposed some kind of like very crazy scheme for like a reorg attack that would, incentivize miners to org out the bad blockers, something like that. I seem to recall there being some kind of crazy scheme pitched along those lines.
But I mean, to be honest, I think it's unlikely to happen. But I
Yeah.
mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I guess on the positive side, though, I mean, look, Bitcoin adoption is growing. Yes, I mean, we're down from the high right now. So, people are kind of scared. The fear and greed index is sort of at a low point now, and people are kind of a bit bearish. Um, I think people just have to like learn to zoom out and understand, like, I mean, here's how I'm thinking about it. And, I'll get your response on that. But the way I'm seeing it is, look, we're going to get a lot of the things we wanted, not all of them, and not when we thought it would happen. Like when I was a noob, I thought it was all going to happen so quickly. And obviously now, 13 years on or whatever, it's a long process. And nowadays I'm kind of looking at like power law in terms of like adoption rates and things like that. And so, I'm just kind of, I guess, resigned to that aspect of it. But I do think Bitcoin is going to change the world. I think adoption is going to carry on. It might be a few more decades. Maybe it's two more decades or whatever in that range. And it will have a real impact on economics and the world, even if it's not the ideal vision. And I'm still hopeful that we get some kind of a CTV or something like that, and maybe not right now. Maybe people will eventually come around to that. So I guess that's where I'm at. Where do you where do you want to land, and have any closing thoughts?
I'm happy to say I agree with all that. Although I'll put my, signature pessimistic bent on it. Look, fiat debasement is realer than real. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. Gold and silver have seen their day in the sun. But, as someone who's like reevaluating those things periodically after being a Bitcoiner, you just can't look at them seriously in the same way. It's like, okay, can China like fabricate gold? How do I know this thing is real? I don't have a mass spectrometer. If I want to sell it, I'm going to take some huge spread right on the chin and, trust UPS with however much money. It's like, it's just a nightmare. And, there really isn't any alternative to Bitcoin. It's really the only halfway plausible way out of this like storm that's headed for us. And so I still really appreciate it in that sense. I think it's still working for that use, even not like in short-term literal terms. It's still, from a technological standpoint, kind of the only plausible thing that can, operate on the other side of whatever's coming, unless, yeah, we really do revert to some kind of bizarre gold standard where they're sure if you're being inflated, and, countries are like carting around, giant planes of gold to do net settlement and stuff. I mean, maybe that happens, but by comparison, Bitcoin just seems to be such a better medium for that kind of value transmission. So it's still a beautiful thing. It's still absolutely one of the coolest things to work on. But yeah, it's just it's tough as an engineer when you kind of see what the possibilities are and what the things you could be getting are, but you're not getting. And trust me, you want some level of disgruntlement among your engineers so that they're working to get more for you.
Well, yeah, let's leave it there. So, yeah, we covered a few things. Obviously, the quantum bearishness, as well as Bitcoin protocol aspects. Listeners, make sure you follow James online. You can find him at JamesOB. And of course, the website ctv-csfs.com. James, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Stephan. Always a pleasure.